to the team presenting so that they are able to move forward with our webinar today.
Thanks, Julie. This is Michael Santos. I'm a registered legal services attorney with Bay Area Legal Aid, and I am today's facilitator for the webinar entitled Providing Civil Legal Services to Students Experiencing Homelessness. So thank you all so much for joining us this Friday morning for those of you on the West Coast, and Friday afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. We are joined today by three other amazing lawyers doing providing legal services to students experiencing homelessness. So we will hear from Kelly Russo from the American Bar Association, Paige Joki from Education Law Center, and Patricia Nix-Hodes from Chicago Coalition for the Homeless in the next hour of this webinar. So a couple of things before we actually get started and hear from our awesome presenters today. We have two objectives for today's webinar. So the first one is to understand common legal issues involving legal services available to young people experiencing homelessness. The second objective is learning to collaborate with lawyers who work with young people experiencing homelessness. And generally speaking, we're going to try to accomplish four big things today, or try to cover four big topics today. So first, what are the legal issues that our partners, some of the speakers today, see in their specific communities? Second, we're going to try to answer or cover the question of how do lawyers help families of students experiencing homelessness? Third, we're going to talk about some of the challenges in providing legal services to students experiencing homelessness. And fourth, and equally important, we're going to talk about some of the practical tips and considerations to ensure students have access to legal services. So just a note, we're not going to cover McKinney-Vento specifics today, but you are more than welcome to ask specific questions after today's webinar. And we are allocating a few minutes after this webinar ends to field any questions that some of our viewers may have. And one more thing to cover, for those of you who are unable to join us live for today's webinar, there are other opportunities to hear from our great speakers. We will be presenting at the NACY's 31st Annual Conference in Washington, D.C. on Sunday, November 3rd, 2019 at 3:45 p.m. Eastern Time. And the title of that session is Collaborating with Legal Aid Lawyers to Support Families and Youth. During that session, we will share strategies for collaboration that will support students and youth experiencing homelessness. And that session will include an overview of common legal issues and rights of young people experiencing homelessness, including access to public benefits and other programs that can support them and their families in moving out of homelessness. So the panelists for that conference session will share models of providing legal services to families and students who are experiencing homelessness, including special legal aid programs for unaccompanied homeless youth. The panelists will also discuss ways that legal aid lawyers can help school districts and states implement McKinney-Vento through technical assistance, training, and advocacy for students. So before we actually hear from some of our local state partners, I wanted to introduce you to Kelly Russo from the American Bar Association to talk about some things going on the national level. Kelly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Russo, and I am with the American Bar Association Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. So we're a national organization. I'm based in DC, and we track best practices across the country, work with local communities, and provide resources so that we can ensure that the youth you are serving have access to lawyers and have access, more importantly, and most importantly, to education. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Homeless Youth Legal Network. The purpose of the Homeless Youth Legal Network is to improve outcomes for homeless youth by increasing capacity and connectivity related to legal services. So how do we do that? The network features a national legal hotline, data and training based on our 12 model pilot projects, law and policy advocacy, and a collaboration function that's in partnership with stakeholders from across the country. It also includes a national directory of legal services providers, as well as a listserv of over 450 providers and advocates, and not just legal advocates, serving homeless youth across the country. The listserv provides the opportunity to ask legal questions, seek referrals, and discuss policy initiatives and best practices. Next slide. By way of background, about 2 years ago, the Homeless Youth Legal Network began with a mapping of existing legal services and unmet legal needs. Sadly, at the time that we did that study, we were only able to identify about 30 organizations providing legal services for unaccompanied homeless youth in only 20 states, which means that at that time, more than half the country didn't have any lawyers specifically serving homeless youth. Today, our directory includes programs in only 32 states, so there's progress, but still a dire need for attorneys serving homeless youth. Now, as many of you know, legal barriers impacting homeless youth can be complex and messy and prevent youth from accessing education, in addition to housing and employment, identification, medical treatment, and more, all of which affects the youth's ability to get a good education. Legal barriers to education are very real roadblocks that typically require legal intervention, and we have learned through our model programs that having a lawyer involved can remove legal barriers and really set a youth up for success. Third slide, please. The Homeless Youth Legal Network is meant to be a free resource for you. We offer technical assistance and trainings on how to engage with lawyers in your community. Law and policy advocacy at the national level, collaboration with national, state, and local stakeholders, including cross-systems community roundtables where we brainstorm with communities on ways to engage attorneys in this work. Like I mentioned before, we also have an active listserv, not just lawyers, over 450 advocates, and it's a space where folks can ask law-related questions, seek referrals, discuss policy initiatives and best practices. We also have that national directory of legal services by state that's kept updated regularly. We also have a library of resources that includes webinars, videos, toolkits, reports. Most recently, we did a webinar in June titled Addressing Legal Needs of Students Experiencing Homelessness. And then next slide, please. One of our most popular resources is our publication, Educating Students Experiencing Homelessness, which is now in its 5th edition. Is formerly known as Educating Children Without Housing. It's the most comprehensive resource on the education of students experiencing homelessness available, and it's used primarily by state departments of education and local school districts. It contains strategies to assist communities to exceed McKinney-Vento compliance and move towards an even greater commitment. It includes information on collaborating with community agencies, relevant changes in federal law and regulations, best practices for serving students, and more. There's a link to purchase the book on the slide. And next slide, please. Lastly, how to engage with the Homeless Youth Legal Network. We have our website, which is where you can find all of these resources. It's ambar.org/HYLN, and that's on the slide. Then also, we welcome you to engage with us on social media. The slide shows our Twitter handle and how to follow us on Facebook. And then I invite all of you to join our listserv. You can email homeless@americanbar.org or hyln@americanbar.org, or just shoot me an email and I'm happy to add you to that listserv. And then we invite you to help us to continue to map the existing legal services and keep our directory updated. So if you take a look at our directory on our website, if there's a legal program in your community that serves youth experiencing homelessness that's not listed, please email me or call me so we can be sure to keep the directory as accurate as possible. Lastly, request technical assistance. I'm more than happy to speak one-on-one with you, brainstorm different ways to engage lawyers, and help you find lawyers within your communities. We serve as a resource in that way as well. Back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Kelly. So just as a reminder, if you want to learn more about other legal aid organizations or want to be connected to them, another way to do that is actually to get in touch with Kelly Russo and join the Homeless Youth Legal Network. Because all the speakers on this panel today are part of the Homeless Youth Legal Network. So that's one way to actually be able to connect with your local legal aid or local legal services provider. So as Kelly had mentioned, the Homeless Youth Legal Network works with local legal aid organizations, including the organizations joining us today. So speaking for the Bay Area Legal Aid, we are one of the partners involved with the Homeless Youth Legal Network, and our Youth Justice Project, in particular, within Bay Area Legal Aid, provides young people experiencing homelessness with wraparound supports, services, and legal representation by providing early identification and intervention through collaboration with community-based organizations. And Bay Area Legal Aid provides technical assistance. We provide educational resources and materials and legal assistance through advice and counsel and brief legal services in different areas concerning youth experiencing homelessness. And so that includes foster care benefits, accessing foster care benefits, ensuring that they have access to health benefits, if they need assistance with SSI or supplemental security income, working with disability-related legal issues, housing issues, immigration, if there are any family law issues, if they need assistance with obtaining public benefits, if they have any credit report issues or consumer law issues, or if they need assistance with employment law issues. Those are the range of issues that we cover and provide legal assistance within Bay Area Legal Aid's Youth Justice Project. Additionally, we provide assistance to help young people seal their juvenile records if they have one and if they are eligible for sealing. And the way we accomplish all this great work within Bay Area Legal Aid is we work with young people ages between the ages of 12 to 24, and we also work within our unit with a social worker so that we can actually provide both assistance with legal services, but also other wraparound supports and services. And the Youth Justice Project serves different counties of the Bay Area. We collaborate with different courts. We also collaborate and have partnerships with local homeless youth shelters so that we are able to reach some of our most vulnerable clients. And we do a lot of outreach to local providers, including schools. And so I know I had talked about different range of legal issues that we cover at Bay Area Legal Aid, in addition to the education issues that many of our audience members today deal with on a day-to-day basis. So that's pretty much what Bay Area Legal Aid does. And again, we are one of the members of the Homeless Youth Legal Network with the ABA. I'm going to turn it over to Patricia from Chicago Coalition for the Homeless so that you can hear more about what they're doing in Illinois. Patricia?
Sorry, this is Patricia Nix-Hodes. I'm with the Law Project of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. The Law Project is part of a broader community-based organization, the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. And in addition to the Law Project, our organization has an organizing department that works directly with people experiencing homelessness and involves them in our work, as well as a policy department which works on solutions at the state and local level to address many of the issues we see when we're dealing with families and young people in schools. Next slide, please. So the Law Project specifically was founded in 1997, and after we had done some work, we realized that young people experiencing homelessness, particularly unaccompanied youth on their own without a parent or guardian, had unique legal issues that they faced, and also barriers to accessing legal services because of their homelessness, and also because they were on their own without a parent or a guardian. So we launched our Youth Futures mobile legal clinic, and that model is really based on, we go to locations where young people are already receiving services, and that includes schools. So we do legal clinics at predominantly high schools, but sometimes elementary schools, and also drop-in centers, shelters, community settings, because some of the difficulty that young people have is, actually the cost of transportation to come to our office in the city. And one issue we help young people with a lot is identification. And some buildings downtown in Chicago require identification to even get into the building. So we want to build trust by being in the community and being where young people are already receiving services. So we provide civil legal services and some limited criminal legal services to unaccompanied homeless youth as well as families. And we have 6 attorneys in total in the Law Project, and we have 4 attorneys focused on our Youth Futures mobile legal aid clinic. Next slide. So we do a variety of work for families and for youth. We do work specifically around McKinney-Vento and other education issues. We partner with many school districts and collaborate with many school districts to provide training and technical assistance. We do a lot of community outreach and sharing information about the legal rights of homeless students, and helping students access preschool and fee waivers and sort of selective enrollment or magnet schools, and then other non-McKinney-Vento education issues such as residency or discipline. We assist college students with financial aid issues. And also in Illinois, we recently passed a law that allows community college students in certain types of programs to access SNAP benefits. So we help students with that. In addition, in our Youth Futures project, we do a lot of public benefits work. We help young people get SNAP benefits, access health care, TANF, Social Security, disability if they're eligible, and as well as identification documents. We do some expungement work and helping with consumer issues. In Illinois, we have a law that's about 5 years old called the Illinois Bill of Rights for the Homeless Act, which is a anti-discrimination civil rights law for people who are homeless. So we have helped some people with issues under that law, as well as the First Amendment and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I talked some about Youth Futures. This slide has an example of a palm card, one of our outreach materials, where we distribute this widely so that young people know where we will be, where we have regular outreach clinics, the location, the day of the week, the types of issues that we help people with, and the in addition to these very regularly scheduled outreach, we also have other events that are legal clinics and provide legal services in the community. We also have worked on an app and a website called Streetlight Chicago, which connects youth to services as well as legal assistance. And I think that covers the law project of the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless.
Thanks, Patricia. So now we're going to turn it over to Paige Joki from Education Law Center to talk about and hear more about what they're doing in Pennsylvania.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Paige Joki from the Education Law Center. I'm a staff attorney there. And the Education Law Center of Pennsylvania is a nonprofit legal advocacy organization that is dedicated to ensuring a quality public education for all children in Pennsylvania. And we work specifically as a part of that to eliminate barriers that young people face because they're experiencing homelessness. Education Law Center has 3 key priorities, which include adequate and equitable school funding, equal access to quality public schools, and dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline and other pathways to confinement for young people. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk this afternoon about a few pieces of ELC's recent systemic litigation that apply to McKinney-Vento eligible students. Can you hear me now? I noticed that somebody mentioned that they couldn't hear me on the side. Can somebody confirm? No, you can't.
Paige, you just sound like you're a bit far away, that's all. I can hear you, you're just a little quiet. Paige, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Where did I drop off? I'm sorry.
No, go right ahead. I think you had just started talking about the systemic impact litigation that you were working on in Philadelphia.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. So the GSV Rose Tree Media School District litigation is the decision that is the highest ranking decision in the country, as it was decided by the Third Circuit, which was the first circuit court to weigh in on the educational provisions of the McKinney-Vento Act. And this decision is instrumental because it reaffirms that the McKinney-Vento Act does not impose a time limit on duration of homelessness, which means that the students we serve who may experience homelessness on multiple occasions or across multiple school years should not be denied the protections of the McKinney-Vento Act simply because their experience with homelessness has been extended. This decision also held that schools cannot unilaterally declare a student ineligible where the student's living situation remains unchanged. In this particular case, there were 2 students living in the same household that were siblings, and the school district had recognized one student but not the other, and then had decided that the student's situation had simply persisted long enough, and so they had refused to provide McKinney-Vento protections. This case is also important because it advances the rights of students who are living doubled up due to loss of housing or economic hardship, which, as we know, are some of the students who are most likely not to be identified despite being squarely within the protections of the McKinney-Vento Act. This case was sort of based on the LR case, which ELC did litigate, which created a preliminary injunction and established enforceable rights under the McKinney-Vento Act for students to remain in their schools of origin regardless of the duration of homelessness. And turning lastly to our most recent piece of systemic litigation, the Education Law Center filed a state administrative complaint with the Pennsylvania Department of Education on behalf of students who were unaccompanied in the Philadelphia School District. In this case, one of the named students had been wrongfully graduated, and the second student was given an education program that could not meet her needs, and her education goals were summed up with the fact that she should be able to learn how to blow her nose after sneezing and dispose of a tissue, which is clearly not an educational program. Both of these young people were unaccompanied and also had IEPs. As a result of the state administrative complaint, the School District of Philadelphia was required to create a new system to facilitate the prompt appointment of surrogate parents as required by the IDEA, as students can't enforce their own rights under the IDEA. This is important because it also reinforced that folks who are working in street outreach or shelter providers can be temporary surrogate parents before a permanent surrogate is appointed. Additionally, this complaint resulted in the Pennsylvania Department of Education issuing guidance to all of the local educational agencies across the Commonwealth to ensure that unaccompanied students were being properly identified as McKinney-Vento eligible, as well as appointed the surrogate parents that they needed to effectuate their rights. Next slide, please. Education Law Center uses a variety of strategies to advance the rights of McKinney-Vento eligible students. The first is we use impact litigation, like I just mentioned. We also have individual cases where we provide legal consultation and direct representation. One way that we're able to reach communities who are traditionally underserved is we run a helpline, which allows callers to leave a message and then get a call back from an attorney. In addition, Education Law Center provides a direct contact number for attorneys. Prior to my position as a staff attorney, I was a legal fellow at the Education Law Center, and so I gave out my direct phone number to young people who were experiencing homelessness so they could reach a person who would be aware of their rights the first time somebody answered the phone, and then they would be able to connect on the first attempt as opposed to having to leave a message and receive a call back. We also have firmly established partnerships with shelter providers in the community, and we provided my direct contact information to them so a caseworker or somebody else who was working with a young person who might be unaccompanied could make the initial reach out. Another thing that we do to ensure that students, parents, and providers are aware of their rights under the McKinney-Vento Act is to provide free Know Your Rights trainings. In these Know Your Rights trainings, I work to ensure that each one was individually designed for the organization and address the barriers that the unaccompanied young people in those programs were facing. After the trainings, I also sometimes hosted a legal clinic, which allowed me to serve the students who were presently in the shelter at the same time that the training was taking place. Education Law Center also engages in legislative and policy advocacy. Right now, there's a bill that will soon be introduced that will focus on ensuring that young people who are highly mobile, including McKinney-Vento eligible students, students in care, and students who are involved in the juvenile justice system, have their credits appropriately transferred. That way, students who are highly mobile aren't being asked to repeat the same work for which they should have already received credit, which is a key barrier to both remaining in school and also graduation. Education Law Center also provides free resources for students and families, and we provide fact sheets that are designed specifically for young people as well as for parents, and comprehensive guides on the McKinney-Vento Act, students' rights in the special education context, and our most recent guide is on bullying and harassment. If any of you are joining from Pennsylvania and you would like a link to those, please message me and I'm happy to send you an email with all of our resources attached.
Thanks, Paige.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just as a reminder, I know Paige had talked about some of Education Law Center's recent systemic litigation. The publication that Kelly Russo from the American Bar Association's Homeless Youth Legal Network talked about in the earlier slide also has other lessons from litigation and cases that you can take a look at if you have time and you have a copy of that resource. You can take a look at the other cases. The cases that Paige covered today have not been included, so it's really helpful to actually, and I'm thankful for Paige talking about some of these recent litigation updates in the field. So we've reached the second half of our webinar, and I kind of want to switch gears to having a more in-depth conversation with our panelists. So what I'm going to do in the next half hour or so is really ask our panelists some questions that we can all talk about and discuss during the last half of this webinar. And so I wanted to ask the group, and maybe we can start with Paige, what are some of the challenges or considerations that advocates should be aware of in providing legal services to students experiencing homelessness?
One of the challenges that I've seen is that a lot of folks are fearful to identify as being eligible for McKinney-Vento services. So one thing that we tried to do at the Education Law Center is have one attorney handle those cases. That way when people called, they didn't need to disclose. A lot of times folks would just say, I'm eligible, and I would know what that would mean. Another barrier that I've noticed that is very pervasive is folks not being fully aware of their rights. And so when something was happening at school, because Education Law Center focuses exclusively on school issues, folks were unable to effectuate their rights. And so some of the ways that we tried to address those gaps were to go physically to spaces where young people were and provide trainings directly. We also worked with clients to ensure that they knew where their information was going, and if there was a caseworker who could be helpful, that that person was included. So people felt more like they were getting wraparound services, even though the Education Law Center just provided the attorney. Sometimes we were able to partner with a social worker to ensure that after our representation had concluded, the person who that young person was working with could continue to partner with them for the rest of the duration that would be necessary.
Thank you. Patricia, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, I share all of the challenges that Paige mentioned, and as I mentioned before, our model is designed to address some of those challenges by providing our services out in the community and in schools, and also by doing broad community outreach so that people are aware of their rights. We often have someone at the school saying to me, well, the parent never told us they were homeless, so we didn't know. But the parents often don't know unless they have received some information about McKinney-Vento. They may know what their situation is, but they don't know that it makes a difference in terms of school. So we really try to do that broad community outreach. And then one of the things on the slide that is mentioned is privacy and confidentiality. And that can be challenging when we're providing legal services in community settings. In certain community settings, it's relatively easy to get a private space or a private room, but other shelters or drop-in centers are a more communal environment. So we do the best that we can in terms of, given those spaces, trying to find a corner of the room, speaking quietly, making sure that the young person or the parent is comfortable in that setting, and always keeping in mind that there could be another alternative of where to provide the services. But that both in school settings and in community settings, it can be difficult to have the privacy and confidentiality just based on the space.
Thanks, Patricia. So in terms of what we see as challenge, like considerations and challenges in providing legal services to students experiencing homelessness here in the Bay Area within the Youth Justice Project, some of the points I've included in the slide that you're seeing. So third-party involvement. And so as attorneys, we have a duty of loyalty to our client, and that client is usually the young person. But oftentimes that young person may be part of a family, and so there's always some issue and questions around, represent who is the actual client and who we are representing. And so we the way we resolve that issue is really making clear to all the parties involved that our client is the young person and not anybody else. Another consideration that I see on the ground doing this work, providing direct legal services to young people, is the model of legal representation. And so I know it varies across the country, and it varies depending on the legal aid organizations. For those of you listening in, if you're working with a legal aid provider or a legal services provider, you might want to look into the type of legal representation that they can provide, because in many places, lawyers can only provide limited scope representation, and what that means is that they will only provide assistance to a specific legal issue. And that's one of the things that we're actually trying to change in the Youth Justice Project by actually providing wraparound legal services to the young person. And so what that means is that if a young person comes to us with a specific legal issue, but later on comes with other legal problems, which is almost always the case for almost all our clients, we try to help and resolve those other legal issues that the client has. And so you, as advocates, might want to look into that as well, because that would impact or affect the services that could be provided to the young person and or their family. I just wanted to also quickly mention issues around equitability and disproportionality. I think all of us in this webinar are probably aware that homelessness doesn't exist in a vacuum. It often disproportionately affects people of color, people with disabilities, people who identify as LGBTQ, people who have been in contact with the juvenile justice system or the child welfare or foster care system, or people who are victims of domestic violence. And so something to consider as advocates is looking at some of the case law, such as the ones that Paige, Joki from Education Law Center had talked about, and also in addition to the federal law under the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, the McKinney-Vento, there may be other state and local laws that can actually add additional protections to young people and students experiencing homelessness. And on that note, I do want to flag for everyone in this webinar that there is a guidance specific to the McKinney-Vento, the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, and that's issued by the Department of Education. So for those of you who have not had the opportunity to read that or to look over that, we are happy to provide that afterwards so that you can have access to it. But you can access that at the Department of Education's website. And finally, one thing to consider is that if you are actually working with someone with a young person who have had or who is currently in contact with the juvenile justice system or the child welfare system, there may already be another attorney involved or another advocate involved. And so it's really important to collaborate and coordinate with those advocates or that other attorney to make sure that you are meeting all the supports and services needed by the student experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So now I want to switch gears a little bit. We talked about some of the challenges and consideration. I want to talk about some of the tips and best practices that our panelists can offer today in ensuring that students have access to legal services and making sure that advocates can connect with legal aid providers. Paige, do you have anything to say about that?
Here we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. One thing that I have noticed is that oftentimes I find myself sort of in the same place with clients on a recurrent basis. So somebody may have adequate permanent housing for a brief period of time, and then unfortunately the same legal issues that I work to resolve have come up again as that person or family has moved. And so one thing that I try to do when representing either a student on their own or a family who's experiencing homelessness is just to make sure that they know that I'm there if an issue comes up again. That way we can have an open line of communication. I try to ensure that if somebody only has phone access for a brief period of the day, that I'm at my desk during that time, that I can meet with people before or after generally scheduled work hours, and that I can pick up a case again if necessary if the student moves districts or is experiencing the same problem again. Another thing that I found is really helpful is asking the young person what they need from me, especially if they're unaccompanied. There are oftentimes barriers that students are facing that may not have been identified by other folks yet, and it's something that I can do something about as a lawyer. An example of this is very early on in my fellowship, I was providing a free Know Your Rights trainings in an emergency shelter that provides bed space for young people who are survivors of sex or labor trafficking or commercial exploitation, as well as young people who have run away or been pushed out of their homes. And it came to my attention that one of the young people had served detention every single day for a month of school because he did not have the right color shoes as he couldn't afford them. And that would have never been brought to my attention if I hadn't been proactively screening for co-occurring issues. So as a matter of practice, I always screen for truancy. So if the person has a lot of unexcused absences, if there are any school supply needs or uniform needs, as well as if that young person has special education needs that aren't being met. And Michael, I just wanted to add one thing to the shout out you gave about resources earlier. There's also guidance that highly mobile students, including McKinney-Vento eligible students, should receive expedited evaluations to determine their eligibility for special education, which would cut the evaluation time down from 60 days to 30 days. And if folks would like that, I'm happy to circulate the link to that guidance as well. Just message me and I'll get it out to you.
Thanks, Paige. Yeah, and I think one thing to know is that we're sharing all these best practices, and I know many of you are from different states. That should not preclude you from actually using these best practices or models to implement in your own community. In fact, you should actually this should give you some ideas on how you can improve provision of legal services and supports to the young people and students experiencing homelessness that you serve or that you work with in your own communities. So just throwing back the question in terms of what are some of the practical tips to ensure students have access to legal services and how can advocates connect with legal aid providers? Patricia, do you have any thoughts to share?
Yes, specifically with respect to the first bullet point, and that is working to be as trauma informed as possible. And this applies to legal advocates and liaisons and teachers and school-based personnel, really understanding that just the experience of homelessness itself is a traumatic event. And many of our young people who are experiencing homelessness also have a history of trauma. And that's true for adults also. And one thing we did this year in collaboration with the Chicago Public Schools, last school year we were having a number of incidents with Chicago Public Schools where there was a lack of sensitivity in dealing with the family. And sometimes the response we would get from the schools is, well, the family was upset or they weren't speaking calmly about the issue, or something focused on what the family or young person's behavior was without kind of really realizing that they may be going through trauma and not in the best position to be calm and rational. And one of the things we did with the Chicago Public Schools this year, they do a training that, first of all, Chicago Public Schools has a liaison in each and every school building. And those liaisons are trained every year in advance of the school year. And this school year, we worked with parents and students who we had represented who agreed to go to these trainings and share some about their personal story and their experience of homelessness beyond just the school issue, but the stress that they were under and the trauma that they were going through. And it was really successful in getting people working in the schools to really understand that experience and understand the need to be sensitive in dealing with the family and being understanding that many of these families and students have had a history of trauma. So I think that's a really important piece. And then also, like Paige mentioned, there are multiple needs that young people and families come to us with, and they don't always know when they have a legal need. So we also do a lot of screening. If somebody comes to us wanting assistance with SNAP benefits, we know that there's school age children in the home, we will always ask questions about school to be sure all those educational needs are being addressed. And, on the flip side, if they come to us about a school issue, we will do a screening to see if they're eligible for public benefits, if they're, eligible for Medicaid and having any issues with healthcare. And we find that, many people we work with have, numerous legal needs and, of course, social service needs as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for all those tips. Just to wrap things up in terms of tips and best practices, as you can see in your slide, and Patricia had covered the first point, understanding that homelessness is a traumatic event. I think many of you know the importance of providing trauma-informed care. And just from the perspective of providing direct legal services to these young people, especially covering different legal areas that I had talked about that we do at Bay Area Legal Aid, what I had found in terms of understanding that homelessness is a traumatic event is that there's generally a distrust from a lot of the young people that we serve from the different systems that have failed them. And so trying to understand where they're coming from is really important. And also, it's really important to collaborate with other non-legal advocates, because some of the attorneys that may work with the young person may not necessarily be trauma informed or well versed into the needs of young people and students experiencing homelessness. The other piece that I wanted to highlight, and I think this applies to all of us here on the panel, is that legal representation is a process and not an event. And so it takes time. And it could in itself be traumatizing. And so I think a lot of the legal advocates that I work with are working around trauma-informed practices, because if someone comes into our door and has already experienced trauma through homelessness, if we need to ask them additional questions, that might actually re-traumatize them. And so it may take a while for them to actually open up, to build that trust and rapport, to build that relationships. And so in my experience working at the youth unit at Bay Area Legal Aid, I was working directly with young people staying in homeless youth shelters. And sometimes it would take me several weeks before I can actually start talking to them and they can open up with their legal issues so that I can help them. And on that point, teamwork is really critical. And so I work with other service providers, not just legal aid providers, to really understand how to best serve the young person. The other point I wanted to make is, as advocates, we should focus on strengths of the young person and respect the client's agency and self-determination. It's very easy to think about the best interest of the student or that young person without actually getting that young person involved in the process. And so it's really important to keep that in mind when you're making all these decisions. And I think when I was doing direct representation with young people and students experiencing homelessness, is that I try to get them involved as much as possible, because there is some power. There's an element of power, empowerment, in making sure that they're involved in every step of the process, however difficult that could be. And the last point I wanted to make is that the needs of young people, and this is pretty obvious for everyone in the webinar, is that they go beyond legal. And so it's really, really important that we work together, that you reach out to legal aid providers, and that we collaborate and coordinate, because as Patricia and Paige had mentioned before, when a young person walks into our doors, the chances of them having just a single issue is very low. It's almost always the case that they have other legal needs and other non-legal needs. And so you should try to reach out to all the other providers, legal aid providers available in your area. So I think that covers pretty much all of what we wanted to talk about in today's webinar. I'm going to bounce it back to Julie.
Thank you, Michael. We really appreciate you all taking the time today to talk through some of these things. So with that, NACCE has moved to what's called NACCE Talks. So you'll notice that a lot of our webinars have moved to what are called NACCE Talks. So now that this webinar is, our presenters are finished, we're going to move this conversation offline. So we're going to move it, offline to a chat room. So kind of off this webinar format. So we're going to take it into Slack, which Slack is a collaborative hub, similar to like a chat room or an AOL Instant Messenger, where we can share resources. So all of those links and those documents that all of our presenters have talked about throughout the presentation, we can share right there, along with a copy of this PowerPoint as well. And you'll be able to ask some deeper questions through chat messages, whether they be direct or indirect, through that Slack channel. So what that looks like is we will be shooting, actually right now, a link came across in your chat box. It's going to take you to the Slack channel. So you'll just have to enter your email address, check your email for verifying your account, and then log right in. You're automatically going to be logged into what is called the general workspace. And that is where just kind of general questions happen throughout the whole thing. But on the left under general, you will see one called UI. UI will be the first words of it, where we're going to host conversations around this. So if you start posting that general one, we're going to redirect you to that UI one, just so we can make sure that all of these conversations around this topic and around this are in that one spot. And so our presenters are able to look in that one place to be able to access those questions. So I am going to unshare my screen really quick so that I can show you what the Slack looks like in person. So it is, you might, not quite sure what all you're going to see when I open my 8 million tabs I have over here. So give me 1 second. Okay, you should see the Slack channel opening right now on your screens. It looks like it's taking a minute. It might be a little frozen, so there might be a lot of people coming in. Okay, so this is what this Slack channel looks like. Are you able to see that? So there, right here, you see UI vulnerable population, and that's where our conversations will happen. So as people start coming into this screen, we'll be able to post the PowerPoint right there, along with some other things. So we really appreciate everybody's time on this webinar. We're sorry for the technical difficulties at the very beginning, but we look forward to continuing our conversation over into that Slack channel. So with that, I'm going to leave the webinar open for a few more minutes as people start to transition over to the Slack channel, but we will move that conversation there. So thank you all for joining us today. And don't forget to change yourself over to that hashtag UI vulnerable populations outside of that general. I see some comments of not sure how to join, so make sure that you click the link below, enter your email address, head over to your email box, and verify your email account, and then log right in, and you'll see the information right there on the Slack screen. All right, it looks like most people are headed over to Slack, so we're going to go ahead and end the webinar here and move on over to Slack for the next 30 minutes or so, and then be able to monitor it for the next week. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.